sense it or
He's monitoring it, so.
Okay, no sound.
But I would hold it like this. All right, good afternoon. My name is Sonja Schmid. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society here at Virginia Tech. And I'm also the co-director of the graduate program in Science and Technology Studies in Northern Virginia. Welcome to SIREN. This is the 23rd event in a series of seminars, talks, and discussions on nuclear emergency response. The series is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear emergency response. And in the spirit of these types of grants, we emphasize the importance of both research and education. And all SIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement. We also plan to provide access to a recording of their lectures. SIREN, the Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research and Education in Nuclear Emergency Response, is generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region and the Policy Strategic Growth Area. Many thanks to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center and the IT team for their support, and to the students, staff, and faculty excuse me, in the Department of STS for helping to make this happen. Today's talk will be live streamed, and we have another new record of over 150 remote participants signed up. These attendees are joining us not only from our main campus in Blacksburg, other U.S. universities, federal agencies, and national labs, but also from the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and from abroad, including Canada, France, and Germany. Welcome. If you're watching us online and would like to submit a question or a comment to our speakers, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to siren@vt.edu. Also, if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, and we use it only to announce SIREN events, you can now join our Google group SIREN series. Just a little preview, our next event will take place on April 24th. Mr. Lake Barrett, former site manager at 3 Mile Island, will take us back in history to one of the most prominent nuclear emergency response events. Please stay tuned and help us spread the word. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. I'll start with Travis. Travis Bertram is the program manager for operations and exercises in the Office of Nuclear Incident Response at the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy. The program's responsibilities include coordinating deployments and exercising the department's emergency response teams in the areas of nuclear and radiological search, render safe, and consequence management. Mr. Bertram joined DOE and NNSA in 2008 and has worked as a senior policy advisor and exercise planner. Prior to working for DOE, Mr. Bertram was a special mission planner at the FBI. And before joining federal service, Mr. Bertram was a career firefighter, paramedic, and hazardous materials technician working in Austin, Texas. His operational experience includes working and responding to major incidents, including Fukushima Daiichi, Deepwater Horizon, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Mr. Bertram holds a BS in Economics and Business Administration and an MA in Leadership for Public Service from St. Mary's College of California. Next, Dr. Nathan Hoteling is a scientist at the Remote Sensing Laboratory, where he supports a number of the Department of Energy's emergency response teams, including Aerial Measuring System and Radiological Assistance Program. He's currently on assignment as a technical advisor in the Office of Nuclear Incident Response at the NNSA, and he earned his PhD in nuclear chemistry from the University of Maryland in 2008, and then spent 3 years as a postdoc in the Nuclear Safeguards Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Finally, Dr. Daniel Blumenthal. He's the manager of the Consequence Management Program in the Office of Nuclear Incident Response at the NNSA. Previously, he has worked at the Department of Homeland Security's Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, where he was the chief test scientist, and the Department of Energy's Remote Sensing Laboratory as a senior scientist supporting several DOE emergency response teams. Dr. Blumenthal led the initial DOE response team to Japan, where he spent a total of 7 weeks following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident in March 2011. Since then, he has supported many US and international efforts related to lessons learned from Fukushima. Dr. Blumenthal's background is in nuclear physics, and he's also a certified health physicist. He's also a repeat offender. 2 years ago, he presented his team's aerial monitoring activities in the wake of the Fukushima disaster in this very seminar. Welcome back, and thank you for your support of the series. Please join me in welcoming our presenters.
Sonia, thanks for inviting us to talk. And this time we're going to focus. So last time I focused on a specific response we did in 2011. So that was our largest real-world response, where all of our assets under our consequence management program were actually employed in a real-world situation. So today we're going to talk about how to prepare for responding when you don't have situations like that happening regularly. So I'll just review what the mission of our office is. We have leveraged the expertise of the DOE national labs across the country, and our people are prepared to respond to nuclear radiological emergencies over a broad range of scenarios, whether it's searching for radioactive material, to doing consequence management, which is under my program. And it involves both teams that deploy in the field as well as work via reachback at the national labs around the country. And just the photo on the bottom right of the screen is just one example of one of our exercises we did in South Carolina in 2015. I'll mention that a little bit later. And the photo on the left is a picture of one of the Los Alamos fires, where we sent some people to respond as well. So the way we break things up, we have specialized teams to conduct our detection and search mission, our render safe mission, our consequence management mission, as well as our nuclear forensics mission. And I didn't want to bore you with the acronyms of all these specialized teams because you'd probably forget them by the time you walked out of the room. But I just wanted to show you the key mission areas, and under each mission there are specific skill sets and capabilities that those teams train to. For example, under the consequence management pillar here, we do predictive modeling. And during Rob Hayes' talk about WIP a couple of months ago, he showed some of the results of our atmospheric modeling to support that response. We also do environmental monitoring and sampling. And we do lab analysis. We do data assessment. And then we have some medical expertise as well. So those are the areas that we have, and we have teams that support those different capabilities. And the backbone of our response is our people. They're our most important resource. So we have people all across the Department of Energy complex, which is there's many national labs and sites, such as WIP, that Rob Hayes talked about a couple of months ago. So most of the experts are from the laboratories, nuclear scientists, health physicists, radiation technicians, GIS scientists, weapon engineers, the whole gamut of nuclear and radiological experts across the country. And then on the federal side, such as Travis and myself, we form the core of the people that would lead teams during a response. So our day job would be managing programs where we organize the readiness of all these experts at the labs. And if something were to happen, we take off our program manager hat and become team leaders in the field during a response or an exercise, as Travis will talk about. And as far as sort of the numbers, we have hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 people around the laboratory complex. And I call them volunteers in quotes because they have day jobs, whether it's doing site survey work or other work on a Department of Energy site in various departments. But they are trained as a collateral duty to respond as one of our teams in the field or via reachback. So we're leveraging their expertise. We don't train them to be radiation technicians. We just train them in the methods and how to respond during an emergency. Most of them might be doing survey work, 9 to 5, in a orderly, regulated environment. So we train them to operate in an environment which is all but regular. And here I list a bunch of the different skill sets. This is certainly not all inclusive, but this is an example of some of the skill sets. So even with all those hundreds or 1,000 people that are on call to support us during a large-scale response, such as something like the Fukushima accident, but happening in the United States, we would exhaust that pool of our dedicated volunteers. So we would need surge capacity, both in terms of quantity of people to respond. If something goes on for much longer, we would need to swap people out. And we also need additional skill sets besides the people that we have on the hook to respond at a moment's notice. So that's a concept that we're working on developing. It's a lesson learned since Fukushima and over some exercises that we've done. And for example, EPA had something that they formalized after Fukushima. FEMA, certainly, everybody would know FEMA has a robust reserve corps, so we're working to develop something like that. Okay, so I talked about the people, and now on the preparedness side, like I said, we have people who are experts in their field, and we just train them in the specific methods they need to respond. So we build their skill sets. For example, if someone's a health physicist, we're not training them in health physics, but we train them to do radiation dose assessment using our tools and implementing EPA protective action guides that are relevant to emergency response versus whatever guidance they follow in their day jobs doing site regulatory work. And the training is focused at the individual level. I said we're building people's skill sets. We're not building, the interactions, so we're building their skills. Exercises are where we take those trained individuals and assemble them into teams or teams of teams working with other agencies, both federal, state, local, private sector, public sector, and that's where they employ their skills. So there's a distinction between the training and the exercising, and one is never a substitute for the other. That's an important distinction. And Travis will talk about the process for what we do in exercises. And then when we're doing our training, that's where we go into depth developing their skill sets. Typically on the exercise side, since we're looking at bigger coordination, other aspects, we're not doing very complicated, compared to individual training, sometimes the scenarios or the skill sets are not stressed as much because we're working on other aspects of the response, the interaction. That's what's even more important, because you can have individual teams that know what to do on their own, but when you put a bunch of teams together and put them in the field with agencies that they don't work with on a day-to-day basis, that's where the gaps are. So that's one of the big focus areas for large exercises. And as far as preparedness, there are also responses. Like we talked about in the beginning, we're working towards preparing for something we hope never happens, but there are smaller scale, real-world examples of responses or even planned events such as special events. We support events such as sorry, I'm on call actually, so I'll ignore that. So here are some examples of both large consequence management events and small consequence management events. As Sonia mentioned, we responded to the Fukushima accident in Japan in 2011, and that used all of our different specialized teams to respond, where we were for 2.5 months. So that used everything. We also support on the pre-planned side NASA launches that involve radioactive material, such as the last Mars launch or the next one in 2020. Those are just the two most recent ones. So those are planned. We know the time of the launch, the location, so we're prepared in case something were to happen. And 3 Mile Island is much older, but I put it on here just because it was the genesis for the creation of our Federal Radiological Monitoring and Assessment Center, which is the interagency coordination effort for radiological response. So that was that 1979 accident led to the creation of FIRMAC in 1985, and Nate will talk a little bit more about the structure of FIRMAC later on. So we do, you got the same thing. Yeah, just as part of preparedness, I should say, we do weekly tests to make sure that people are paying attention and, are responding if asked. So now here's a bunch of smaller events where we're putting together small responses that are one or a few of our teams. Some of them have national impact. Some of them are just at a Department of Energy site or just off a site. As Rob Hayes talked about a couple months ago, you see WIP in 2014 was on here. That involved one of our regional response teams as well as our atmospheric modelers out at Livermore, California. So you see a lot of responding to small contamination events. So that gets people out and practicing their skills, but not in a large-scale interactive environment. So our people are not just about those low-probability, high-consequence events, but they do get to use their skills in smaller venues. But it's the large-scale responses, such as Fukushima, that require us to do large-scale exercises. And I'll turn it over to Travis, and he'll talk about our exercise and operations program. Travis.
So actually, before we got started, somebody caught me outside and said, actually noticed my pager and said, hey, that's really interesting. I remember seeing one of those years ago. They still make those. And the fact is, yes, they still do make them. We still do wear pagers because part of our job is emergency operations, emergency response. We are on pager recall. He's on duty. I'm actually not, but since I'm the program manager, I get the pages also.
This is not staged.
This is not staged. This is actually a page going out. But it's a test page, so on a weekly basis. So my job is to bring together the operational aspect. So at headquarters, part of my job is, as Dan was talking about, the last list is all of these events that had happened. Part of my job out of DOE headquarters is to get the notification, to find out something is happening in the world, and then actually deploying the team out. So authorizing the team to go out, determining who it should be, and then getting them to deploy. And then once they're deployed, I stand up a team at our DOE headquarters, and part of that is staying in communication with them, staying in contact with the team, supporting them if they need things, if they need items, or fielding requests from information that come from either state, locals, or other federal agencies. So that's the operational side of my job, which is real world. It's pushing the teams out and making sure they can go out and do their job. The other side of my job is running the actual exercise program. And I've got some slides in here so I'm going to talk a little bit about what exercises are. Essentially, exercising is our ability to create an environment to allow the scientists and the teams to go out to effectively do their job. We actually have to create an environment for them to deploy and then go out and do the scientific job that they are prepared to do. Question comes up, why do we exercise? And the first one is it's to test our ability. We're making sure that the rubber meets the road. We say that we are prepared to deploy within a certain amount of time to go anywhere in the United States or anywhere in the world. Well, how do we test that? Individual before we started talking in here actually mentioned, hey, I used to have a team and we used to say we were on call and I could page everybody out and, well, would they really come on a Friday night when everybody's out having a good time and I page everybody? Are they really going to show up within a certain amount of time? Or are they really going to respond? Well, part of why we exercise is to actually test that. One of the type of exercises we do are called no-notice exercises. We will actually do a no-notice, and it might be something as simple as paging us, like our pagers are going off now, which they want us to call back in to make sure that we got the call, or all the way to the point of we can actually develop a full exercise that involves calling out a team, letting them respond back in, loading their bags, getting on an airplane, flying somewhere, and actually going to do their job in a location. So really, the purpose of the exercising is to keep us proficient, to keep us, make sure that we're able to do what we say we can do. Another purpose of actually doing exercises is validating new equipment, new processes, or new ideas. We do work within the national labs. We have a lot of scientists. We have a lot of academia. A lot of new ideas that come up, and there might be a proposal of, hey, the way you're doing something, somebody might think there's a better way to do that. An exercise is an excellent opportunity to actually to try something new to see if it works. And if it does, well, we can then actually proceduralize that, put that into our plans and policies, and then when we go out for a real-world event, we now have that new process. Another thing we do with exercising, and it avails us the opportunity, is to improve upon lessons learned. We are always interested in our community. We always want to make ourselves better. We're always trying to figure out what went well, what didn't go well, and if something didn't go well, how do we improve upon that? How do we make it better so that next time we don't make the same mistake again? Exercises allow us the opportunity to actually look at past problems, past issues, past lessons learned, and improve upon them again. When you go out and exercise, you can actually improve what might have been a problem in the past. And of course, I have to throw in there, the National Preparedness Goal is part of our government mandate, is we do work under executive orders, and part of the National Preparedness Goal is through Department of Homeland Security. We follow the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program. We don't just, quote, exercise. There's actually a design, there's a methodology, and there's a process that goes into how to exercise. Department of Homeland Security actually, they manage the design process for how the U.S. government exercises. And if you actually just Google HCEP and look for the DHS links, there's lots of information on exercise design, exercise methodology. So getting a little bit into exercise design, I had a colleague years ago who his business card, he was an exercise planner, and his business card said, Bob Jones, exercise planner, such and such organization, imagination synchronizer. And I always liked that. And to me, exercise design is imagination synchronization. For us to demonstrate our capability of what we can do on consequence management response, me as an exercise designer, exercise planner, practitioner, I have to create and design an environment that will allow Dr. Blumenthal and Dr. Hotelling to go out and actually do their job. One of the things for DOE, our exercises tend to be very technical. They can actually tend to also be very expensive because I actually have to employ people like Nate to create the environment to allow our scientists to go out and execute their job. It's not just about getting on a plane, flying somewhere, setting up a laptop and going, okay, I've been able to respond, I can do my job. No, we actually have to create, I have to invent a reactor accident. Well, what's the plume that comes out? What are the isotopes? What are what are those products that come out into the environment? We actually have to simulate that and create that. So our exercises tend to be very complex. They can take 18 months, 2 years to plan, depending on the complexity, and they can involve a lot of people. Some of our exercises might go up to 1,000, 2,000 people to be involved in an exercise. So within the HCEP design process, what we're doing is we want our exercises to be capability-based. One of the second slide or the third slide that Dan had showed what our core capabilities were: search and detection, render safe, consequence management, nuclear forensics. what we're doing is we are exercising that core capability. So for consequence management, we want to exercise our ability to go out and do consequence management. Our exercises have to be objective driven. So, like I said, we're not the objective of the exercise of a large scale exercise is not to go out and deploy and do our job. We actually develop specific exercises which are written to our core capability and the subtasks that were listed under this. So Dan mentions, modeling is something that we do. Well, we actually will write a specific exercise objective that talks about we want to exercise our ability to model a nuclear reactor accident in such and such a state. That actually could be one of our objectives. Or we can go very technical within that modeling realm. And next slide, I'll go into why that's so important. Some of the different kinds of exercises. There are multiple levels of exercising that's listed within HSEEP. The ones I listed here, the highlights are workshops, tabletops, command post exercise, functional, full scale. A workshop is something that is more discussion based, and the purpose of a workshop is to come out with a plan. You want to actually discuss something, think about something, talk through something to actually create a plan out of that. Command post or tabletop exercise is actually where we get folks together into a room and we want to, discussion based, we want to talk through our specific plans. So it's not a discussion to create a plan, it's actually to talk through what we would do and what our plans are and how we would execute those plans. Command post exercise is actually putting people into our command post. So with us, it's DOE headquarters. We have a command post. FEMA has a command post, the National Response Coordination Center, NRCC. I'm actually used to acronyms, so I have a hard time speaking them out. We can get multiple command posts together to, once again, exercise their jobs. We don't actually put teams into the field, but we stand up at the headquarters levels to say to practice and exercise our communication ability between the different centers. Functional exercise is when a team will actually deploy out to the field and will actually go do something in the field. And then when we get to the full-scale exercise, that's when we bring everything together and we deploy teams into the field. It's interagency. We work with state and local partners. We work with our federal interagency partners. And that all comes together for multi-days to do sustained operations. And as you can see on the graphic, exercise design in the life cycle, it's a circular process. We design and create the exercise. And ideally, we want our objectives for that exercise design. We want it to come from previous lessons learned. So we build in previous lessons learned. We do our exercise design. We execute our exercise. While we're executing the exercise, it's very important that we collect observations and we evaluate how well we do. We grade ourselves. How well do we do on the response? How well do we do on the science? And then that leads into an evaluation process and then into a corrective action program, which what are the things that went well, what didn't go well, and for the things that didn't quite go well, how can we improve upon them, and then how can we put those into objectives the next time we exercise. Within my own program, a different way of looking at this, and as I talked about, we can spend 1 year to 2 years planning a national level exercise. Very complex, lots of meetings that go into these. So we'll have our concept development, initial planning, mid-planning meeting, final planning meeting, and then actual exercise execution. Up to that red line, everything to the left, that's the planning process that can go into an exercise. And for a full-scale consequence management exercise, we will spend more than 1 year doing it, and we will often spend $500,000-$600,000 doing the design of the exercise, and that's before we get to the execution of actually deploying our teams out into the field. Because as I said, imagination synchronization. I have to create that environment to allow them to go do their job, to do their technical, very specific job. And another one here is, our objectives, we want to come from previous exercises. So, the cyclical process of my planning is we plan an exercise, we execute an exercise, and then we do our after-action evaluation process, and then the term we actually use is we call it the before-action review. We take the information we've done in the past, We bring that, and that becomes the starting point for our planning process for our next exercise. So we start with those things we want to work on our next exercise. So for me, I was an exercise practitioner, a lead exercise planner for close to 5 years. I did a really good job of designing, planning exercises. As an exercise planner, one of my failings was I actually didn't do very well on the after action, the lessons learned process. I would spend a year planning an exercise, and we would execute, have a great exercise, but then after spending all that time, I would now have to write an after action report. And that's the last thing I want to do because I was always looking at the next exercise. So when I stepped into the program that I'm in now, one of the things I looked at was I actually separated within my program. I have after actions, and then I have a corrective action program. So I actually separated out my corrective action planners, my evaluators, and their full-time job is to work on the evaluation process and to help build a corrective action program. Like I said, we're always interested in improving ourselves. We always want to see how we can do better. We're a federal agency. We are taxpayer funded. I'm a steward of the taxpayer dollar. That's very important to me. I do not want to waste money as a taxpayer. So if I'm going to spend money on an exercise to maintain we have a capability to do this, I want to make sure that we always build upon and improve upon everything that we can, and that's through the evaluation process. So when we're doing an execution of an exercise is actually happening, people are doing stuff, we actually have evaluators that go around, and they are collecting observations. And what we try to do is make sure that we can tie their observations specifically back to exercise objectives or tie it to specifically skills and tasks. A person doing modeling has specific objectives, and there's certain things that they have to do. Well, we try to evaluate, are they able to do it, yes or no? We try to be objective. And if something doesn't happen, is it a failure of the training? Is it a failure of equipment? Or is it a failure of process? Those are all the things that we have to go and we have to look at during the evaluation process. And as I said, we take that, we put it into an after-action report, and then from that, we develop our corrective actions. Now, one of the things that's important to note here is this Lessons Learned Corrective Action Program is not just exercises. That program also applies to our operational. When we do operations, we do collect observations. We do an after-action process for real-world operations. So personally, I don't distinguish between an observation from real world or from an exercise. To me, they're both just as valid, both as important. Now, what's unique about my perspective as exercise practitioner, exercise design, I have a methodology of process. I have what I'm standard looking for in exercise design. Are we meeting our objectives? Did we fulfill what we were supposed to fulfill? It's very specific. It's pretty precise. But what's really unique about exercising, and another reason why we exercise, is that there's a lot of information and a lot of data that can come out of exercising. There's tremendous opportunities to do data analysis during exercise. Now, I look at it from the can our teams deploy, yes or no? Can I let my leadership know, yep, we're on call, we can deploy, we can do our jobs, we can technically respond as we want to. But there's a wealth of other information. And I'm going to pass it over to Nate so he can actually talk about some of that other evaluation that can happen that's outside of my standard exercise design.
All right, so just to recap things, Dan talked about the missions that we support and the capabilities that we have. And Travis talked about how we use exercises to verify that we're actually capable of supporting these missions and meeting these, whatever our objectives are for a particular mission. But when we talk about these really high-impact, low-probability types of events, they don't happen very often, maybe once a generation. So it's easy to think about us just sort of living in a bubble, living in our own little box and becoming complacent. So we have our, we plan, we execute exercises all in this tiny bubble. So it's really important to try to get outside of this bubble and to think outside the box. And so there's a couple of different ways that we do this. One is something that Dan alluded to, is that we participate much more frequently in these smaller scale types of responses. So we're actually going out into the, quote, real world and doing real responses and doing things that we didn't necessarily plan ahead of time. Another thing we do is we participate in things like technical conferences, workshops, working groups, outreaches, and things like this. And this gives us an opportunity to explain to people outside of our bubble what we do and how we do it, and it gives you all an opportunity to raise your hand and say, hey, you haven't thought about this, or what about that? And a third way that we do this is through a sort of a more exploratory type of analysis of the data that we have available to us from these exercises. And that's the part that I'm going to focus on right here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give two very specific illustrative examples just to show you how we can use these data that we collect from exercises to sort of look at things from a different angle and potentially learn some lessons that we would not otherwise have learned. The first one, I call these experiments. The first one is an experiment to measure the flow of information or communication flow through the FIRMAC, so the Federal Radiological Monitoring and Assessment Center, something that Dan alluded to earlier. And this is really not necessarily an asset in and of itself, but a conglomeration of different assets. And it holds its current form as a direct result of the response to 3 Mile Island, as Dan mentioned earlier. And so during 3 Mile Island, as a lot of people know, a lot of different federal agencies, different local groups went out and collected radiation measurements on the ground for their own purposes, reported back through their own chains of command. And so the people who had to make decisions and official recommendations about what to do during this incident were working with part of the information. And as a result, there was conflicting information going out. Obviously, this is a big problem. So the FIRMAC was created following that with the idea that this is at one central place that can conglomerate all of the data, do all of the assessment, and convert that into some sort of I guess, one picture, whole community assessment. So it goes without saying that we would expect the communication within the FIRMAC to be pretty solid. But how do we know that's really the case? Is there a way that we can measure that? And if we can measure it, what can we learn from it? And so my first illustrative example here is something that we did during one of our large-scale exercises to try to map out the flow of information. And so I always love to show org charts in my presentations because people love to look at org charts. Right? So don't worry about the details of this. Suffice it to say that there is some organizational structure in the FIRMAC. And I wanted to show this because what we did during this exercise is I put together a survey that looked something like this, where exercise participants circled the position they filled in the FIRMAC, and they indicated all of the other positions within the FIRMAC that they interacted with. And within each box, there was a 1 to 5 scale that said I interacted with them. At a level of 1 means that I talked to you, a couple of times or once during the exercise. A level of 5 is I sat down next to you and we worked together a lot. All right. So what I did with those data is you can create a network graph like you see here, and this is supposed to look sort of like that in the sense that it's the same organizational structure. So at the very top, you see what's effectively the management group. And then you see a bunch of vertically arranged circles. These are the different divisions in your org chart. And at the very bottom is the interagency group. And so I'll just take a minute to explain exactly what you're looking at here. And I've got 3 slides that look very similar to this. And I'm going to talk about exactly what we did with the data and what we learned from this. So each of these circles represents one of the positions within the FIRMAC. So these are the nodes, and the lines between these nodes represent that, according to the survey, the people who filled these positions interacted with each other to some level. In this particular picture, the size and the color of the nodes is proportional to the number of links times this 1 to 5 scale. So this is called the weighted degree. So what would we expect to see in something like this? So I would expect the people at the top of the chain of command to probably have the most different people that they're talking to to the highest degree, because it's their responsibility to know what's actually going on to get the big picture. And you can scrutinize this a little bit and see some exceptions, but by and large, that's really sort of what you see. But I want to go to the next one. Oops. So here, what we wanted to measure is how information flows through the FIRMAC. So this shows the information hubs or potential bottlenecks in the information flow. To measure this, we use a metric called the between-us centrality. And what this really means, the between-us centrality is higher if a particular node falls within the shortest path between 2 any two other nodes in your network. So in other words, if I take that one node, that position out of your organizational structure, or out of your network, it's going to have a disproportionately large impact on the flow of information across your network. So what would we expect to see on this? Well, I would expect the folks at the management level of each of my divisions. So think these vertically arranged circles. At the top of that is the manager of each of those divisions. I would expect them to have a high value for the between us centrality, because if you think of formalized hierarchical communications, people report up their command chain, and then the manager will facilitate communication horizontally and then vertically to their management and so on. What we actually saw here is, you can see here, there's a big dark circle here. This is the GIS person. This is the person that's sitting there making maps. And it really does make sense when you think about it from a different angle. But it surprised me when I first look at this. So if the mission of the FIRMAC is to take all of the data, analyze those data, and then put it in a way that it can be communicated to support some decision, really the GIS, most of our products that we create are map-based products. So our GIS person is making those products. So if I took the GIS guy out of the network, that's going to cause a disproportionately large problem. Right? So this is an example of looking at things from a slightly different angle and learning things that are sort of obvious when you finally see them, but you have to find a different way to look at it. And so another one is we can also, since we have a network, we can run a community detection algorithm on this. So basically, you're looking what all the subgroups are within the FIRMAC here. What we would expect is that each division would represent its own community, assuming you've got these formalized lines of communication. And if you really scrutinize this, I'm not going to go into great detail on this one, but if you really look at it, you sort of see that in some cases. In some cases, you don't see it at all. And really, there's a couple of take-home messages here. Number one, some of the exceptions that you see are because people sat next to each other that weren't in the same division, so naturally they start talking to each other. Another one is what I call the structural effects versus the personal effects. The structural effects, I call, these are directly result from the organizational structure that you see here. And the personal effects are, if I work with you on a daily basis, I share an office with you, I communicate with you a lot on a day-to-day basis, during the exercise or during the real-world event, I'm probably going to talk to you a lot more. Versus if you work on the other side of the country in a different lab, and I never communicate with you, except during this exercise, this response, it's not going to be quite as smooth, potentially. Right? So and those kinds of effects are definitely there when we look at these data and we fold that in by what we knew about how the exercise went about. So again, these are things that aren't necessarily surprising after you think about them, but when you ask somebody before they've looked at the data, their answer might be a little bit different. So it's kind of a way of looking at things from a slightly different angle. So now I'll move on to the second example here. The second example has to do with the analyzing the comments that come from the exercises. So Travis talked about this a little bit, and he showed you this picture right here of kind of the circle of planning an exercise, executing it, collecting feedback, doing evaluation, and then feeding that into corrective actions, which then feed back into the planning process for the next one. And so my little schematic on the left-hand side here is an attempt to show how we actually go about analyzing those. So the smaller circles at the top are observations. These are the comments, the raw comments that people submit. And so what we do is people who work for Travis, who are very good at what they do, they read through all of the observations and they pick the ones that are related to each other out and they conglomerate them together, and based on those they generate findings. And then based on the findings, they'll generate lessons learned. And based on lessons learned, they'll create corrective actions that then feed back into the circular process. Now, when I started my job working for Dan, we had a big exercise, and I read through all those comments, not all of them, most of them, and I read the after-action report, and it turned out about half of the comments had been used in the after-action report. Well, half of them weren't there. I mean, some of them shouldn't be used because the observation is test message or Nate did a terrible job, and obviously that shouldn't be used. But there's also the fact that people are people, right? People have biases. If I read something, a comment about something I'm passionate about, I'm going to remember that. if I read something that's deeply technical that I just don't understand, it's probably going to fall to the back of my mind. That's less likely to be actionable for me personally, right? Because I'm a person, and people have natural biases and limitations. And if there is a million comments, I'm not going to have all those in my mind at the same time. So is there a different approach that we can use? And so I'm going to take a sort of a sidestep here and show you this example and then transition back into how I applied this to some of our exercise data and what we learned from that. So in the trucking industry, there's been apparently I'm not an expert in the trucking industry. I just found this paper that I thought illustrated the point really well. But in the trucking industry, there's been a long-term debate about whether or not to put electronic monitors in trucks to monitor how long truckers are driving for. Because if a trucker drives for too long, he's going to be tired, and he's more likely to get into an accident. So the truckers tend not to be in favor of this because they see this as Big Brother watching them or a lack of trust, and I'm sure there's a variety of other reasons. But the regulators and the organizations tend to be more in support of this electronic monitoring. So this group here, this research group, when the federal government is proposing a new regulation, it goes out for public comment. Those public comments, it turns out, nowadays are available on regulations.gov. So this group took all of the public comments from regulations.gov for a variety of different regulations proposed over the years and ran this what's called the topic modeling algorithm. And what this does is it takes all the comments and uses word correlations to partition those into different topic clusters. And that's what you see is these vertical columns. Don't worry about all the details of this, but suffice it to say all those words that you see in each column, these are the most frequently used words associated with each topic. And so the researchers looked much more closely at each of these topics and kind of pulled out general themes of these. And I'll just touch on the first two here. So the first two that I have on the left-hand side here are monitoring devices. So both topics touched on monitoring devices, but it turned out when they looked closer, there were different perspectives on monitoring devices. So the researchers also looked at the source of these comments, and so the comments that came from individuals tended to be from truckers, and the ones that came from organizations tended to be regulatory bodies and such. And so you could see, if you look up at the top of the column here, I've got a little bar chart. One of the topics was disproportionately from organizations, and one was disproportionately from truckers. So this algorithmic way of analyzing these textual data naturally led to two different perspectives on a common theme. So that's kind of interesting, and you're starting to look at things from a different angle, learning new things. So is this something that might be applicable to our analysis of exercise data? All right. So this is just kind of my schematic to show how we might apply this to exercise data. So notice that I've got a lot more observations on this slide so now we can use, number one, all of the data. Number two, maybe we can use observations from a range of different exercises, either over a series of years or over different assets that we have, just to see if there is any latent themes, any hidden topics that maybe we didn't think of when we first read through these. Maybe there's some trends over time where things got fixed and those comments don't show up anymore, or something just keeps showing up over and over again, or something new showed up. So my schematic here says you take the observations, run this topic modeling algorithm on it. You've got different topics. You can do some analytics on it, make graphs and stuff. That's the kind of stuff that I really like to do, and then see what kind of things you can interpret. So just as a test case, I took the observations from just a single exercise, just to see what we could learn. And the graphic that I have here, I just like to show it. The y-axis shows the different topics from the 350 or so observations that I analyzed, and the x-axis just shows all of the different topics. And you can kind of see how they grouped up into the different topics. Each observation is distributed through all the different topics. So here I compare the algorithm results to the output of when people looked through all the observations and divided them into unique topic themes. So the y-axis, these are the individual topics that humans, when they look through it, the fine people that work for Travis came up with. And at the bottom is just the arbitrary topic clusters that came out of the algorithm. And so I have an abbreviated list of the frequently used words at the bottom associated with the different topic clusters. And I just want to go through just a couple of these just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that we can learn from this. So the column all the way to the left, if you read through that, it says sample, lab, analysis, track, determine, lack. This clearly has something to do with lab analysis samples, probably something to do with tracking them, maybe. And if we look at how this is distributed through the human-created topics, you can see it's kind of distributed mostly evenly throughout. And importantly, if you look at the very top cluster, the human cluster, it says none. That's because those observations weren't classified in one of these. So maybe this is an indication that there's a theme that wasn't picked up on by the people reading through this, or maybe it's just buried in the others. You can't quite conclude it from just reading these bunch of words and looking at this distribution, but it's clearly an indication that we need to maybe take a closer look. Another one that I'll point out is kind of the third one from the right-hand side. And so if we just read through this, you get data, process, time, day, RAM, review. RAM is short for our database that we store our raw data in. It's called RAMs. And if you look up the vertical column here, you can see it's strongly associated with one of the man-made, human-made topic clusters called CMWeb, which turns out to be the system that we use to distribute our data products to the interagency. So clearly there's a strong data theme in this particular cluster. And it's nice to see when some of the clusters correlate strongly with something that people put together. So it means they're sort of intuitive at least. So these are just two kind of illustrative examples for how we can use this exploratory type of analysis on data that we have available to us from these exercises to force us to look at things from a different perspective, to try to stay outside of the box and to prevent us from becoming complacent and just kind of living in our bubble and not getting any, thinking that we can respond, but not actually being able to respond. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dan and let him wrap this up.
Thanks, Nate. So just to wrap up, I started off by talking about preparedness and what goes into that, how we do a lot of training and exercises, because when something does happen, such as our response to Fukushima, where we were practicing our skill sets that we train to every day, but it was in a completely different environment with completely different partners. So as a lot of people say, it's all about the planning, not the actual plan. So, and the fact that we train in different environments, and as Travis brought up, we create that environment for people to practice in. It lets them, when this happens for real, enables out-of-the-box thinking. So we're not just responding by rote. We're trained to think on the fly. And Nate talked about some of the trends that we've seen in exercises over the years. The first experiment he talked about was all about the communications. And this is both about, physically people talking to each other, sitting next to each other. It's about working within your teams as well as between teams, and as also between agencies. These large responses involve a whole cast of characters, different federal, state, local agencies, private sector, even public sector. So it's about those making sure people communicate and interacting, because time is of the essence. So if the communications channels and the way people interact with each other aren't efficient, then responses are delayed and decisions are not well informed. And as Nate referred to 3 Mile Island, that was an example of how things didn't go smoothly. And another important aspect on the communication side is it's important to understand what questions are being asked. A lot of times we'll get questions from decision makers, from leaders, from emergency managers, and they're they are asking for something specific, but it's not really framed in terms of what decision they have to make. So what we see during exercises often is we have to tease out what decision they're trying to make, what question they're asking, so we can make a product, a map product, as Nate mentioned, that helps them make that decision. So often I say what we do, we don't do response, we do decision support. But a big part of what we're learning in exercises is to understand the question that people are asking. Another thing that we learn during exercises is about the sustainability of our operations. As I mentioned during my intro, we responded to Japan for 2.5 months. Typically, during an exercise, they last for 3 to 5 days, and you're barely getting started after a week sometimes. So, but we do learn that there, can be issues if we were to go beyond 3 or 4 days when people are getting burnt out. If we had to go for 2 or 3 weeks, what would we do? So we take those lessons and feed them back into some of our ideas, such as I mentioned the idea of building a reserve corps, or we've worked with FEMA to create a whole new position that'll be in the National Incident Management System called a Radiological Operations Support Specialist, someone who's a radiological SME who can support someone in an incident command post, answering those questions that they have about radiation, since nobody, most people on the incident management side don't really understand radiation, so they need help interpreting things. So that's one outcome of an exercise. Also, sometimes we learn that there's bumps in the road in our concepts of operations or how we do our workflow. Sometimes it's just procedural, but sometimes there's actually a policy hindrance there. So we come back from the exercise and work at the federal headquarters interagency level and make updates to policies that streamline what happens in the field. And then we'll sometimes it's not as high level as a policy update. It's just refining our procedures and our concepts of operations, as Travis talked about. So that's all we have. I guess we have time for questions now. Thank you.
Okay, any questions, comments for our speakers? In the meantime, if you're watching us online and would like to ask a question, please send it to SIREN, SIREN, at VT, as in virginiatech.edu.
I'm Nathan Roskoff. I'm a graduate student in the nuclear engineering program at Virginia Tech. I was just curious, how often do you guys perform these full-scale exercises? Because they seem, as you said, there's a lot of preparation for them. So I'm just wondering how frequently they're actually performed.
So across our entire community response, we do on average 4 to 5 full-scale exercises a year. For Dan's program, we try to do once every 18 months. So for full consequence management deployment exercise, full scale, it's every 18 months. So our next one will be in February of next year.
So I'm Ali Hagigat, professor and director of nuclear engineering program at Virginia Tech. What was your involvement with Fukushima, actually? You said you worked with them for 2.5 months. And can you talk about what you did?
Sure. So our involvement was we sent a team over to Japan to do environmental radiological monitoring. So we have teams that do ground-based surveys, collect samples, as well as aircraft-based aerial radiological surveys. So we put our radiation detectors and our trained personnel, like Nate, on U.S. Air Force helicopters and aircraft, and flew over the area between 0 and 80 kilometers of the damaged power plant, and mapped out the radiological deposition on the ground. And so we started supporting the U.S. military, and the U.S. Embassy had concerns. They didn't understand what the environment was, and there's 80,000 military personnel in Japan and a lot of American citizens, so they wanted information. And very quickly, within days, we started working closely with our Japanese counterparts and doing joint survey missions with them.
I'm Doug Chapin from NPR. You've talked about exercises, and I get the message that when you're doing exercises, you're in charge of the exercise, and you're saying what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and all that. If there's a real accident, who's in charge? Do you work for somebody else, or do they work for you? How does this, what's the organization that's in effect if Metro calls up and says we've got a radioactive release in the Metro? Who's in charge?
So actually, most of our mission is support to other agencies or state and locals. So while I might actually be doing an exercise, creating an exercise, part of the exercise design process is to actually go out and solicit the input and support from that agency organization that we would actually be supporting. So, and the example of the exercise that we're going to do next year down in Florida, part of our exercise design is reaching out to the state of Florida, Florida Radiological Control, and actually NASA is the primary federal agency, and we would be in support of them. So part of our design is actually to create or simulate the organization we would be supporting. But we are mostly in a supporting role.
And the specific agency in charge depends on the scenario, whether it's FEMA or a state agency or FBI or NRC.
Sure.
Thanks. So, what was your lesson learned after participating in the Fukushima accident? And also, did you communicate with U.S. utilities, NRC, the agencies in the United States, what you've learned?
So our role in Fukushima was on the environmental monitoring side, not on the reactor accident side. So that was NRC's role, and so they've communicated with the industry here as well as in Japan. So our lessons learned in Japan had, and I mentioned some of them already, the interactions. We were interacting with different partners over there, the military a lot, State Department, our counterparts in Japan. So we learned a lot about applying our methods with different partners. The communication, sometimes we had questions coming from the White House here in D.C., but trying to tease out what decision they were trying to make was a lesson that we have to find out what question people are asking, so we know what product to deliver to help them decide that. We also learned some lessons, technical methods about how to better analyze our aerial survey data, or what types of instrumentation we should bring to the field for a nuclear power plant accident. Strontium-90 was of concern, and that takes a long time to analyze for in the lab. So we're developing a fieldable instrument to do near real-time determination of potential strontium contamination. That's one example. Aerial surveys, we did not have our own aircraft, so we learned to analyze our data without the luxury of having a radar or laser altimeter on board the aircraft. So those are just some examples of the technical lessons learned.
I would add on the policy side was, Dan actually had to work with the White House, and we had some actually White House direction of how do we as U.S. government respond internationally. So one of the kind of the program that is spun from that is that we now work with Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and we actually exercise with them now, and we're starting to do that on a regular basis, where 4 years ago we didn't do that.
So that was, for example, their lesson learned was if they had to do humanitarian assistance in an environment that was potentially contaminated, they didn't want to put their people or their non-governmental organization providers of assistance in harm's way, delivering blankets and water in a contaminated zone. So they realized they would need closer interaction and feedback from us so they don't put people in harm's way when they deliver their assistance.
Thank you, gentlemen. I just have a quick question. Sure. I'm Angela Wilson-Turnbull. I've done a lot of work in traditional military response, cyber attack, grid attack. The radioactivity is like a whole new world, right? So I was just curious if you can share a little bit about, in that environment, what are some unique components that need to be considered from a planning and implementation perspective, and what do you see as the gaps that in the U.S. in particular, what do we really need to focus on to get caught up, to get everybody ramped up based on the things that you've seen? Thank you.
I'll start, and then I can turn it over to Travis and Nate. So one of the challenges in a radiological environment, each function that's part of a response is more complicated. So some of you may be familiar with the emergency support functions, the way FEMA organizes support to emergencies. There's transportation, mass care, public information, all these different capabilities. And each of them is more complicated by the presence of radiation. So transportation, as an example, where people may think that they're going to evacuate a certain way, maybe that route is contaminated. So it requires additional thinking and different, decision-making processes. People are afraid of radiation, so that is a complication to decision-making. On the mass care side, potentially healthcare providers are worried about themselves getting contaminated. So we have our medical experts do a lot of training with healthcare providers, teaching them methods, teaching them that they're not going to get contaminated or injured by treating contaminated casualties. So that's one way it's different. As far as gaps, I'd say a lot of it is in communication or people understanding radiation, not being so afraid of it and being different. You want anything else on gaps?
One of the things I was thinking about as Dan was talking which is incredibly difficult for us, is the public messaging, which is the general population is afraid of radiation. To throw it back on an exercise experience, planning an exercise in a city where the local planners had in their mindset global thermonuclear war. And the fire and police basically had the attitude of, why should we even be here doing this exercise? We're all going to be dead. In the very next conference, I actually had to bring up a scientist to actually go over, the threat that we're worried about, a small improvised nuclear device, the planning scenario of 10 kiloton. Well, yes, it's a catastrophic event. There are a lot of fatalities. In a city like, pick a city like Las Vegas, you have 3 million people. Well, if 20,000 people die, you still have a significant number of people that have to be taken care of. And it was watching the look on their face when they switched and went, you mean we're not all dead? I was like, no, we're not all dead. We all have a job to do. We need to do that job. But a big part of that is the public messaging, which is radiation scares people. And for those that, I look out in the crowd as those who are in the field, it becomes second nature. We understand it. It's there or it's not. It's measurable. Outside of our community, the general public, it scares them. And that's one of the things that I think we continually come back to. That's one of the things that Dan continually works on, not only public, but also with our senior leadership. How do we message, what the issues are, what the problems are?
Just a second. I would like to read one online question from Nate Kishbor. He is a radiological health specialist at the New York State Department of Health. He asks, what are some of the common obstacles or difficulties you've encountered when planning an exercise, and how have these obstacles shaped or changed how you plan for future exercises?
From my perspective, part of it is, being that we're a federal agency, I'm actually budgeted to do exercises. One of the largest obstacles that we actually do run into is when we're working with state and locals is the fact that they're operating off a state budget and they actually have their own local constraints. Planning processes. We did have actually up in New York when we did an exercise 2 years ago, working with New York and New Jersey, we actually run into the issue where the state workers in New York cannot travel outside of their city, funding-wise. It takes them 6 months worth of, or 3 months worth of budgetary approval to simply travel to to New Jersey, other side of the river, to attend a meeting. So from the planning perspective, a lot of times what we have a hard time with is actually engaging with the locals who we might have smaller programs or departments who 100% want to engage, want to do this exercise, but at the higher emergency management level within the state, they might not actually have the budget or their leadership willingness to participate.
And in addition to budget constraints, working with some of our state or local partners, sometimes because we're creating a low probability, high consequence exercise environment. Some of them wonder, why should they bother? They get enough emergency management practice responding to floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, natural disasters, other things. And some of them don't see the need to, they know how to respond. Just adding on, radiological dispersal device to the scenario doesn't add any value for them. And we've had some exercises where some potential stakeholders backed out, but then after they realized that they would have gotten a lot of training value, so they asked us to come back in a future year and do an exercise. So, but part of it is budget, and part of it is they only have so much time and energy to devote to preparedness, so they focus on those things that are more likely to happen in their jurisdiction.
We've also had experience of political implications. So, like one of the exercises that we would look to doing is a nuclear detonation. From the emergency management perspective, state and locals, fire, police, EMS are very interested because they want to know if this happens in their city, are they prepared? How can they do this? At the political level, we reached the mayor or up to the governor who says, you are not doing a nuclear detonation in our city, because then there will be why are you doing exercise? There might be a perception that you're doing exercise for a reason because you think it's going to happen here. So, political, budget.
So my name is Ruben Howard. I'm a graduate student at the Elliott School at GW, just across the river. And first of all, I want to say thank you very much for this talk. It's been incredibly informative. And network analysis and communications makes me the policy wonk and data wonk inside of me be like, I'm like, oh my God, this is fantastic. So my question, because of my involvement in international affairs and that type of thing, is we've discussed so far our involvement in terms of actual response. At Fukushima, for example, how do we do exercises with countries overseas, or do we? And in that environment, what do we learn there that we can apply here or apply to actual responses where we're asked for help in other nations?
What we've done, we do a lot of exchanges with other countries, workshops, exercises. Nothing sort of on the level of us responding in Japan, working with our military and our Japanese counterparts. We've done a lot of tabletop exercises with other countries, and sometimes when you're in an international diplomatic environment, it's more challenging because in a crisis mode, kind of all people let their hair down and respond more naturally. But in diplomatic environments, people are more reserved. So often we'll do scenarios where we'll pick a scenario that impacts the U.S. and we'll pick one that impacts the other country, and we'll talk about how we would each respond if something happened in our country. So that way everyone's responding in their own lane and not, stepping out of turn. And we've also done some international multilateral exercises. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, last year led an exercise that tested their response assistance network. So there were teams from multiple countries responding to a common scenario, and that was a rare occurrence. That was very good for all the countries involved, trying to work together and do similar analyses and compare, their procedures, their results, things like that. So there are a lot of examples.
I would like to read a couple more questions that were sent in by Dr. James Phelps, who teaches for Nova Southeastern in Florida and Aurora University in Illinois, and is also a former Naval Radiological Controls officer. I think I'll forward that to you. He wants to become part of your reserve corps. And then also, this is a question for Nate. On your interactions chart for the 2016 exercise, the PIO, which I take it is the Public Information Officer, received only minimal interactions and only with the chief scientist and agency manager. Shouldn't the PIO also be dealing directly with the GIS tech, particularly in a world where media is instantaneous, imagery is essential, and misinformation goes viral faster than real data?
That was a really good question, and I'm glad somebody was looking closely at that graph. So there's sort of two responses to that. One is the scope of that particular exercise, or the exercise within that, the experiment, within that exercise was focused largely on the FIRMAC and the players within the FIRMAC. And so a lot of the FIRMAC to outside interactions were not included. And so that is especially where the PIO is going to start to see more, I guess, more links in that particular experiment. And the second part about the GIS person, we try to keep protected. We usually try to arrange the room in a way that he or she is harder to access. And the reason is because this GIS person, as you saw, is extremely important. It's extremely important that they have their nose in the computer making the map products. And we have other folks on the in the FIRMAC, so the product scientist, for example, or the assessment manager would be the person with whom the PIO would interact ideally, not directly with the GIS person. So,
yeah, to add on to that, he mentioned this position called a product scientist. It was in response to an exercise lesson where we learned that our scientists that are analyzing the data don't necessarily know how to communicate that to outsiders, whether it's emergency managers or the public information officer. So we created another position of scientists who were better trained and just better suited to framing the technical information in ways to communicate to others and interacting with people like the public information officer and asking them what they want, and then they would be the interface to those assessment scientists and GIS specialists to make the products. But as Nate said, yeah, we would shield those people because they're speaking different languages from the public information people. So we inserted translators in between, basically.
Any other questions here? Okay.
The communities you have is very busy, at least to me. Too many people. And do you have redundancy? Actually, can you lose people from your community, and does it impact your process?
But community, do you mean the number of people we have available? Yeah, we typically try and maintain a certain number of people within each skill set. Some skill sets have a lot of redundancy, so our radiation technicians, there are many of those across the DOE sites. Some of the management positions, there may only be 3 or 4 of those in the country.
Also, I didn't see any communication with the White House. Is there any communication?
The question is there any communication with the White House? The answer is there's a lot, and maybe I'll let Travis, he can talk about that.
Yeah, there is interaction with the White House, and it's on multiple levels. So at a programmatic level, we do interact with the Science Office and National Security Council. Dan has interaction programmatically with the White House. Operationally, yeah, so in fact, during the Fukushima response, I actually worked in our headquarters on night shift, and one of my duties was at 4 a.m. I had to have the one map that went to the White House Situation Room to be put into the president's daily briefing, and that was on a daily basis. So, it depends on what it is in the interest level and the implications. Where, yeah, for Fukushima, it was kind of the one thing we had to do on night shift was to make sure that we had that one product, that one page that Dan in Japan is working at. Daytime Japan operations, nighttime here, but then for us to flow that into senior leadership.
And we did learn the White House is one customer that you don't want to get it wrong or be late with. Oh, with the White House, you don't want to be wrong and you don't want to be late.
So one other question from Dr. Phelps, and that connects to a question that I actually also had. As you noted, your exercises last from a few days to maybe 5 days, yet disasters and real-world responses last months and possibly years, as demonstrated by Fukushima. How tied is your agency to the support and deployment capabilities and experiences of FEMA, for example, or other agencies? And phrased another way, how lifelike are your exercises? Do they start at 9 and end at 5? Or how do you get people to exercise a night shift or a 4-day, 24-hour commitment?
It varies. We do strive very hard within our own world, with our own environment, to create the most realistic. So we strive for 24/7 response, and we would love to do it 3 to 4 days. Unfortunately, we are constrained fiscally, and because we're not, oftentimes we are in support of another agency. Sometimes we are beholden to their schedule. So if we are working with a state, oftentimes they can only work 8 to 5 because they can't afford overtime and they can't afford weekends. Those are actually constraints that come into that exercise, and we as an agency strive to do 24/7 to do continuous operations. That unfortunately is about the best we can do, and it was actually one of the last bullets that Dan and I talked about before coming over here. Was that one of the things we talked about is the difference between exercise and reality. The length and duration is actually one of them, and that's one of the things that we have to cognitively, consciously think about within our programs. Is that, yep, when we exercise, it's only going to be a couple days, but in reality, this might be days, this might be weeks. We saw very quickly in Fukushima that some of our responders weren't quite prepared for duration. And that is something that we have to look at. But it's not something we can easily exercise, and part of that is fiscally, and part of it because our pool of responders do come from other jobs within the national labs. Sometimes we're not able to pull them away from their day job for very long.
As far as duration, so we're constrained in how long we can pull people away, but sometimes if we want to exercise different aspects or phases of a response, in our 2016 exercise, we began it 21 days after a notional release from a power plant. So it got to exercise a different set of skill sets and tasks during a response. EPA in 2010, they began an exercise 60 days after a dirty bomb went off in a city. So it was exercising different tasks, different people in charge. For example, EPA was in charge of the response and DOE was supporting, versus immediately after a response is different. So we, in lieu of exercising for 2 months, we try and do things a little differently sometimes.
Any other questions?
Can you elaborate a little bit about the types of Başak Losar, Virginia Tech. Can you elaborate a little bit on types of exercise, types of data collected during the exercises, how you collect them, and how you decide what data will be collected? And have you ever qualified an exercise as failure? What's a failed exercise, and what do you do with it?
I'll just start. As far as data collected, I'll distinguish. During the response, there's the kind of information that we, as the technical community, are collecting. If we're doing environmental monitoring or sampling, we're collecting that data, so we're doing our activities. And then I'll let Travis talk about the data, so-called data, that we're collecting about the flow or execution of the exercise.
So I think on the data collection, there's a couple of different pathways. One of them is collecting standard observations, which is we actually solicit input from all the participants. We solicit input from evaluators, and that's simple data collection. We will, something as simple as we set up a generic email inbox, and we're always asking people, if you see something, if you have an observation, type a quick email, send it to the email inbox, and then that's when our evaluators will go through and sift through those observations, categorize them. In the past, we've actually used programs where people could go in and say, if they have an observation about X, Y, or Z, they could actually go to, okay, this is observation X, and it's dealing with this objective. So that's information data collection. On the actual science data, part of their job, like on the consequence management, is peer review, quality control. They're actually doing that themselves. And when you said, has there been exercise failure, one of the things I think about is I actually would say, yes, we have had exercise failure, but I qualify that to say we in the past have had exercise design failure? Is it through these guys doing their job? Yes, they've determined that the data we created, that environment we created, it doesn't stand up, it's not real, and these guys will quickly pick it apart and say, yeah, that's not what you meant to say. So there's that aspect of exercise failure. Now, when you think to actual failure of us to do our job, within 10 years, I can think of one exercise where we stressed the responders to such a point that they pretty much got to the point, said, we're going to kind of break from policy and we're just going to do what we're going to do. So I think in 10 years, I've only seen once where not failure to do the job, failure to follow the processes and procedures as outlined. There was that breakdown, that failure. But when I think of exercise failure, I actually think more on the exercise design side, which is, were we able to design and create an exercise that is basically worth the time and effort that we put people into?
I would add to that, in terms of the measurement data for an exercise, sometimes it's simulated data, sometimes it's background data, sometimes it's real contamination data. It all depends on what the specific objectives are of the exercise and how it's being executed.
I so love this discussion. Can you guys do this on a regular basis, please? No, I was just thinking about 9/11, and at the FAA Command Center at the time, we didn't have a real-time decision support system, which has now been resolved. And other exercises that I participated in, we did use various decision support system tools. Have you found that there are particular tools either that didn't work so well or others that you could recommend for those planning exercises in the future? Thank you.
For planning or executing?
That's both.
Yeah. I see that's an ongoing initiative to find what are the best tools for managing our workflow and tracking the requests we get. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the software package called WebEOC that a lot of emergency operations centers use. We've used that on a limited basis, and we've adapted some commercial off-the-shelf packages to make our own sort of workflow tracking systems. But I think we haven't found the solution that answers all of our needs. So tracking our workflow to keep it as efficient as possible, not dropping the ball on a particular tasking or making a tasking take too long or things like that. We're still working that out.
I would also add one of the things that I think that we are the federal government, which means we are 2 to 3 years behind industry and the rest of the world on programs, computer tools. We are the government, and that's one of the things that frustrates me is that I can do more on a personal iPhone than I can do on the top of the line government issued some of the stuff we have, and we do run into security and we call them security and policy roadblocks. Is we have policy restrictions on our IT infrastructure that oftentimes it's not technical, it's policy. And we have, especially in the emergency response world, where we're going out into the field and we have to be prepared for anything that is given to us. And oftentimes, 100%, our job is to follow the spirit and intent of the security policies and protocols, but that doesn't equate to being able to do our jobs in reality. So oftentimes, it's a policy restriction that we have to fight.
And I'll add one more thing. I said, we don't have the ideal solution for, say, tracking our workflow. Part of that is there also isn't a one-size-fits-all solution because we have the different missions we talked about in the beginning. There's nuances in the work, and that mean, once a system that works for one mission or one team doesn't really work for another. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution either for us.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope that our presenters can stick around for a couple more minutes if you have additional questions. Please join me in thanking our presenters. That was a terrific presentation and discussion. Thank you.